I'll tell you the moment they stopped laughing, because I remember it exactly. It was the morning of April the 19th, 1937, and the whole of Dawes County, Missouri, was white. Not snow white, frost white, the kind of white that means something has died overnight, the kind that settles on blossoms and leaves and fruit and kills them so quietly that by sunrise the damage is done, and all that's left is the silence of a county staring at its ruined orchards. But I'll come back to that morning. First, I need to tell you about the dirt. My name is Calder Nye, and in the spring of 1935, when I was 15 years old, I inherited 12 acres of the blackest, strangest soil in Dawes County, Missouri, and the laughter of everyone who heard about it. The land had belonged to my great-aunt Bess Nye, who had died that February at the age of 79 in a house she had built herself on the western slope of Tabor Hill, half a mile from the town of Garnett. Bess had no children. She had no husband. She'd been engaged once, in 1894, to a man who made the mistake of telling her that a wife's place was in the kitchen, and she'd returned the ring and spent the next 41 years proving that a woman's place was wherever she decided to put herself. She had one surviving relative, me. My parents had died in a house fire when I was 3, and I had been raised by a neighbor, Mrs. Kessler, who was kind and old and whose own health was failing by the time I turned 14. I was not, technically, an orphan by the time Bess died, but I was close enough to one that the difference didn't matter to anyone except the paperwork. The will was read in the office of Mr. Beecham, the county clerk, on a Wednesday afternoon in March. There were 6 people present: Mr. Beecham, his secretary, the Reverend Alt from the Baptist Church, Hollis Turk, who owned the feed store, Mrs. Angeline Pace, who had been Bess's nearest neighbor and who had come to make sure she wasn't owed anything, and me. I sat in a chair that was too big for me, wearing a clean shirt Mrs. Kessler had ironed that morning, and I listened. The will left me everything: 12 acres on the western slope of Tabor Hill, the house, the barn, the tools, and, here's where the laughter started, the soil. Miss Nye specifies, Mr. Beecham read, adjusting his glasses, that the property is bequeathed to her grandnephew Calder Nye, with the particular instruction that he attend to the western bottomland, which she describes as, and I am quoting, the finest 12 acres of growing soil in the state of Missouri, which every fool in this county has called cursed, poisoned, or dead, and which will one day prove them all wrong. Hollis Turk was the first to laugh. Not a mean laugh. Hollis was not a mean man, but the laugh of someone who has heard a joke he didn't expect. Bess's magic dirt, he said, shaking his head. Lord, she was still going on about that dirt when she died. Mrs. Pace smiled thinly. She spent 40 years digging in that bottomland. 40 years. You'd think she'd have found gold down there for all the time she spent on her knees. There's no gold, Hollis said. There's nothing. That soil is black as tar, and nothing grows in it right. Anything you plant comes up strange. Too fast, too big, wrong season. I told Bess 100 times, that land is sour. She wouldn't hear it. Reverend Alt, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, said nothing. Mr. Beecham folded the will. That's the whole of it. The property passes to the boy. They all looked at me. I was 15, thin, quiet, with dirt under my fingernails because I had been working in Mrs. Kessler's garden that morning and hadn't scrubbed hard enough. I was the kind of boy that adults looked through rather than at, not troublesome enough to notice, not exceptional enough to remember. The kind of boy whose name people forgot between introductions. Son, Hollis said, not unkindly, that land isn't worth the taxes on it. Bess was a fine woman, but she had peculiar ideas about that dirt. My advice? Sell the timber on the upper slope, let the county take the rest, and go back to Mrs. Kessler's. Thank you, I said. I'd like to see it first. I should tell you about Bess, because she is the reason for everything. I had visited her 3 times before she died. Mrs. Kessler drove me up to Garnet in her Ford on a Saturday each summer, from the time I was 12, and Bess and I would spend the afternoon together on her property. She was a small woman, brown from the sun, with white hair she wore in a braid, and hands that were permanently stained dark from the soil she worked. Not dirty, exactly, but dyed, as if the earth had marked her as its own. She did not talk to me the way most adults talk to children. She did not ask about school or friends or what I wanted to be when I grew up. She talked to me about dirt. She would take me down the slope to the bottomland, a broad, flat stretch between the base of Tabor Hill and the creek, and she would kneel, and I would kneel beside her, and she would dig her hands into the soil and hold it up and say, "What do you notice?" The soil was black, not brown, not dark gray, black, the deep, absolute black of charcoal or ink. It was loose and light in the hand, almost fluffy, and it was warm. Not sun-warm, the bottomland was shaded by the hill in the afternoon, but warm from within, as if the earth itself were generating heat. I said this to Bess on my second visit, and she smiled the way people smile when someone has finally said the right thing. "That's exactly right," she said. "It's warm. Do you know why?" I didn't. "Because it's alive," she said. "More alive than any soil in this county. Feel it." She pressed a handful into my palm. It was dense with moisture, but not wet. Spongy, almost springy, as if it were breathing. This soil has more living things in a handful than there are people in the state of Missouri. Bacteria, fungi, nematodes, microarthropods, a whole world working, decomposing, building, generating heat as a byproduct. "This isn't dirt," Calder. "This is an engine." She told me its history as she understood it. The bottomland had been collecting organic material for centuries. Leaf litter, fallen timber, animal remains, all of it composting slowly in the moist, sheltered depression between the hill and the creek. The depression was shaped like a cupped hand, she said, open to the south and sheltered on 3 sides by the hill, and the shape mattered because it trapped moisture and warmth the way a bowl traps soup. But there was something else, something deeper, something that made this particular piece of ground different from every other bottomland in the Ozarks. Bess had dug test pits, dozens of them, over decades, each one marked with a wooden stake and a numbered tag, mapped on a chart she kept pinned to the kitchen wall. At a depth of 4 feet, she had found a layer of ash. Not wood ash, not fire residue, volcanic ash. Ancient ash from an eruption so old that the geological record barely remembered it. Deposited in this depression when the land had been a shallow sea or a floodplain, compacted and mineralized over millennia into a porous, calcium-rich stratum about 18 inches thick. The ash layer was extraordinary. It held heat the way a stone hearth holds heat after the fire has gone out, absorbing warmth during the long Missouri summers, storing it in its millions of tiny air pockets, and releasing it slowly through the fall and winter in a gentle, steady exhalation that kept the soil above it warmer than the surrounding ground. "Think of it like a banked fire," Bess told me. "You know how you bank a fire at night? Bury the coals in ash so they stay warm until morning? That's what the earth did here. It banked its heat in a layer of ash, and the ash has been holding it ever since. Combined with the biological heat generated by the extraordinarily active microbial community in the topsoil, all those billions of tiny organisms decomposing organic matter, generating warmth as a byproduct of their ceaseless labor. The result was a piece of ground that was measurably warmer than any surrounding land. 5 degrees warmer on a normal day, 8 degrees on a cold night, 12 degrees, sometimes more, during the deep freezes of January and February, when the air above the bottom land would shimmer faintly, like the air above a road in summer, and Bess would stand at the edge and hold her hand out and feel the warmth rising and smile the way people smile at something they love that no one else understands. Plants don't know they're in Missouri, Bess told me. Plants only know what the soil tells them. And this soil tells them it's spring when everything else says winter. This was what the people of Garnet called cursed. This was what Hollis Turk called sour. Because things planted in Bess's bottomland did grow strangely. They grew too fast, too early, too abundantly, in defiance of the calendar and the weather and the expectations of people who had farmed the same way their grandfathers had farmed and did not appreciate being contradicted by dirt. Bess had documented everything. In 8 notebooks, I found them later in a tin chest beneath her bed. She had recorded 40 years of soil temperatures, growth observations, planting experiments, and microbial analyses. She had sent samples to the State Agricultural College in Columbia. She had corresponded with a professor of soil science named Dr. Emery Suttles, whose letters, also in the chest, called the Tabor Hill Bottomland a pedological anomaly of considerable interest, and encouraged Bess to continue her research. She had continued it until she couldn't stand any more. And then she had continued it on her knees. And then she had died. And the notebooks had waited under her bed for someone to read them. That someone was me. I moved onto the property in late March of 1935. Mrs. Kessler drove me up with a box of my clothes, a sack of cornmeal, a ham, a jar of blackberry preserves, and a look on her face that said she was worried but trusted me to know my own mind, which was the greatest gift any adult had ever given me. The house was solid. Bess had built it with stone from the ridge and oak from the upper slope, and it had a fireplace that drew well and a sleeping loft and a kitchen with a pump that brought water up from the well. It was small and cold and empty, and it smelled like cedar and old books and something faintly sweet. Dried lavender, I found later, hung in bunches from the loft beams, because Bess had believed that lavender kept moths out of the blankets and sadness out of the rooms. When I closed the door behind me and stood in the silence, I felt something I had never felt before. Not loneliness. I had known loneliness my whole life, and this was not it. Ownership. The house was mine. The land was mine. The silence was mine. I was 15 years old, and I had a place in the world. And the feeling of it was so unfamiliar that I stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes without moving, just letting it settle into my bones the way warmth settles into cold hands. The first thing I did was build a fire. The second thing I did was walk the property. 12 acres is not large, but when you have spent your life in rooms that belong to other people, 12 acres feels like a continent. I walked the upper slope, scrub oak and hickory, rocky ground, good for firewood, and not much else. I walked the fence line, sagging wire on cedar posts, some fallen, most leaning. I walked down to the creek, clear, shallow, moving with the quiet purpose of water that knows where it's going. And then I walked into the bottomland. Even in late March, with the trees bare and the ground still carrying the memory of winter, I could feel it. The warmth. It came up through the soles of my shoes like a slow pulse, and the air above the dark soil was softer than the air on the hill, warmer, almost tender. The soil itself was black, truly, deeply black. And when I knelt and pressed my palm flat against it, it gave slightly under my hand, like something breathing. I had felt this soil before, in Bess's visiting room, in a jar. But feeling it here, in place, connected to the ground that had made it, that was different. That was like the difference between reading about music and hearing it played. I was not starving. I need to say that because this is not that kind of story. Mrs. Kessler had fed me well, and the ham and cornmeal she'd sent would last 2 weeks, and I had enough sense and enough knowledge from Bess's visits to start a kitchen garden immediately. I found seeds in the barn, packets that Bess had saved, labeled in her small, careful hand, dated 1934. Lettuce, radish, pea, bean, squash. I planted the cold weather crops in the first week of April, too early by any normal reckoning, a full month before any other farmer in the county would risk it. And within 9 days, the lettuce was up. Not just up, thriving, dark green and dense, growing as if it had somewhere to be. The radishes followed 3 days later, their red shoulders pushing up through the black soil like small, bright fists. The peas climbed their strings with a speed that felt almost aggressive, as if the soil were pushing them upward, saying, "Finally, someone is planting." I ate my first harvest, a bowl of lettuce and radishes, dressed with nothing but a splash of vinegar from a bottle in Bess's cupboard, on a warm evening in late April, sitting on the porch with my feet in the grass and the light going gold over the valley. The lettuce was the most alive thing I had ever tasted. Not just fresh, vital, as if it carried the energy of the soil that made it. The radishes snapped between my teeth with a peppery heat that cleared my head and made my eyes water, and I sat there eating and looking at the bottomland and thinking, this is what Bess was trying to show everyone. Not magic, not curses. Just soil doing what extraordinary soil does when you give it a seed and get out of the way. I stood in the garden at dusk on the 10th day, with the young plants glowing green in the last light and the soil warm under my bare feet. I had taken off my shoes to feel it, the way Bess had taught me, and I felt something shift inside my chest. A loosening, a settling. I had grown something. In soil that everyone said was cursed, I had grown something alive and good, and it had fed me, and it was mine. A cat appeared on the 3rd day. Not a house cat, a lean gray tom with a notched ear and yellow eyes and the general demeanor of someone who has been in several fights and won most of them. He was living in the barn, I discovered, in a nest of old burlap behind the feed bin. I left him a piece of ham on the barn floor. He ate it after I left and was sitting on the porch railing when I came out the next morning, watching me with an expression of guarded assessment, as if he were deciding whether I was worth the trouble. I named him Cinder because he was the color of ash and because he appeared to have survived things that should have killed him. Within a week, he was sleeping at the foot of my bed. Within 2, he was following me to the bottomland and sitting on the stone wall while I worked, and at night he hunted mice, voles, the occasional rabbit, which he deposited on the porch with the matter-of-fact pride of a provider. He was not affectionate. He was present. That was enough. I found the notebooks in April under Bess's bed in the tin chest, along with Dr. Suttles' letters and a hand-drawn map of the bottomland showing test pit locations, soil temperature readings, and, in red ink, circled twice, the words, "Plant here." The chest also contained Bess's instruments, a mercury soil thermometer in a leather case, a hand lens with a brass frame, a set of glass vials for soil samples, and a photograph I had never seen. Bess as a young woman, maybe 30, kneeling in the bottomland with her hands in the dirt, looking up at the camera with an expression of absolute concentration. She was beautiful, not in the way the word is usually meant, but in the way that a person is beautiful when they are doing exactly what they were made to do. I put the photograph on the mantel. It's still there. I read all 8 notebooks in 6 days. I read them the way I had read books at Mrs. Kessler's house. Late into the night, by firelight, losing track of time, losing track of hunger, losing track of everything except the voice on the page. Bess's handwriting was small and precise and full of a kind of restrained excitement, as if she were constantly holding herself back from using exclamation marks and allowing herself the indulgence only rarely. The margins were full of small drawings, cross-sections of soil layers, diagrams of root systems, sketches of mushrooms and beetles and the tiny thread-like fungi that wove through the earth like a second nervous system. What Bess had discovered over 40 years of patient observation was this. The bottomland on Tabor Hill was not just warm, it was predictably warm. She had taken soil temperature readings every day for 23 consecutive years. Every single day, rain or shine, summer or winter. And the data showed a pattern so consistent it could be used as a calendar. The soil temperature in the bottomland never dropped below 42 degrees Fahrenheit, even in January, even when the air temperature was below 0. In summer, it reached 85. The swing was narrow, the baseline was high, and the implications were enormous. 42 degrees is the threshold. Below that temperature, most temperate fruit trees go fully dormant, and their root systems become vulnerable to damage. Above it, the roots stay active, slowly, minimally, but actively drawing nutrients and moisture, maintaining the tree's connection to the ground. A fruit tree planted in Bess's bottomland would never experience true dormancy. Its roots would work year-round. And when a freeze came, the kind of catastrophic late frost that killed orchards across the Ozarks every few years, the warm soil would protect the roots while every tree on normal ground froze from the bottom up. Bess had known this. She had written it plainly in notebook number 6, dated 1928. A peach or apple orchard planted in this bottomland would survive any frost this county has ever seen. The soil will protect the roots will protect the tree. The tree will fruit when every other tree in the county is dead. I am 68 years old. I will not plant it, but someone will. She had left me the land and the notebooks. She had left me the answer. All I had to do was plant the orchard. I planted the first trees in the fall of 1935. I had decided on apple and peach. Apple because it was the money crop of the Ozarks. Peach because Bess's notebooks indicated that the warm soil would allow peach trees to thrive further north than they normally could, pushing the boundary of what was possible. I bought 20 bare root apple saplings from a nursery in Springfield. Winesap and Arkansas Black, varieties chosen from Bess's recommendations in Notebook 7, where she had listed them under the heading, Trees That Reward Patience. Each sapling was 4 feet tall, bare-rooted, wrapped in damp burlap, and looked like what it was, a stick with ambitions. I didn't have much money. Mrs. Kessler had given me $8 when I left, which was all she could spare, and more than she should have, and I had earned another 4 selling lettuce and radishes at the feed store in Garnet, where Hollis Turk had accepted my produce with the bemused tolerance of a man who doesn't believe in something, but has no reason not to buy it. The lettuce had sold fast. It was 3 weeks earlier than anyone else's, and people who had been eating canned goods since October were willing to pay a premium for something green and alive. 20 saplings. $12. I carried them up the hill on my back in bundles of 5, the burlap-wrapped roots pressing against my shoulders, the weight of them real and purposeful, and I planted them in the bottomland in the pattern Bess's map specified. Not the straight rows that every other orchardist used, the efficient, machine-friendly grid that made harvesting easy and trees interchangeable, but a curved arrangement that followed the contour of the warmest soil zone, spacing the trees according to temperature readings that Bess had recorded decades before. The warmest spots got the peaches, which were more frost-sensitive. The slightly cooler margins got the apples, which were hardier. Every tree was positioned not for the convenience of the farmer, but for the comfort of the tree. And the difference, I was beginning to understand, was the difference between farming and partnership. I dug each hole 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. And when I set the first sapling into the black earth and filled the hole and pressed the soil firm around the roots, I felt something pass between my hands and the ground. Not mystical, not magical, but real. The warmth of the soil against the cool roots. The slight give of living earth accepting a new member. The sense that I was introducing 2 things that had been waiting for each other. Hollis Turk drove by on the road below and saw me digging and shook his head. Mrs. Pace stood on her porch across the valley and watched with her arms folded. The Reverend Alt, passing on the road, stopped his car and called up to me. "What are you planting, son?" I called back. "The future." He drove on. I don't think he knew what to make of that, and neither did I, exactly, but it felt right. I didn't care. I was planting trees in the finest soil in Missouri, and the trees knew it even if the people didn't. The saplings took root within 2 weeks. I could tell by the way the buds swelled, by the color of the bark, by the subtle straightening of the stems as the roots found purchase in that dark, warm, living earth. I watered them from the creek. I mulched them with leaf litter from the hillside. I talked to them because Bess had talked to her plants, and I figured she knew more than I did about what growing things needed. By the following spring, April 1936, the 20 trees had put on more growth than any first-year orchard I had seen in the county. The trunks had thickened noticeably over the winter. I could feel the difference when I wrapped my hand around them, the girth of new wood. The branches were dense and strong, the leaves dark green and glossy, with a sheen to them that June Oglesby would later tell me was a sign of exceptional mineral uptake. The root systems, I checked, digging carefully beside tree number 1 with a hand trowel, filling the hole back in with the reverence of someone opening a gift, were already extending 2 feet into the soil, thick white roots branching into a web of fine rootlets that connected with the fungal network in the bottomland. I could see the mycorrhizal threads, hair-thin, white, running through the dark soil like veins through a body. The trees were not just growing, they were joining something, plugging into the living engine beneath them, the microbial community that Bess had spent 40 years studying, becoming part of a system that was older and larger than any single tree. I understood, kneeling there with my hands in the warm earth. and the white threads running between my fingers that an orchard is not a collection of trees. It is a community. Above ground, each tree looks separate. Its own trunk, its own branches, its own fruit. Below ground, they are one thing, connected, sharing, feeding each other through a network of roots and fungi that no one sees because no one kneels down to look. I bought 20 more saplings that fall, and 20 more the following spring, peaches this time, the varieties Bess had recommended for the warmest zone. By the end of 1936, I had 60 trees in the bottomland, apple, peach, and a dozen pear. And they were growing so fast and so well that even Hollis Turk had stopped shaking his head and started asking questions. "What are you feeding those trees?" he asked me one afternoon at the feed store where I was buying twine. "Nothing," I said. "The soil feeds them." "That's Bess's magic dirt talk." "It's not magic, it's biology. The soil is alive. It feeds the trees, and the trees feed the soil. It's a partnership." Hollis looked at me the way adults look at children who say something that sounds either very smart or very foolish, and they can't tell which. "Your aunt said the same thing for 40 years, and nobody believed her either." "They will," I said. The first ally had already come by then. His name was Virgil Spate, and he was 63 years old, retired from the post office, and he had known Bess for 30 years. He was a quiet man, tall, slow-moving, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked like kindness because it was kindness. He walked up the hill one morning in May of 1936 with a bucket of early strawberries and stood at the edge of the bottomland and looked at my young trees and said, "She always said someone would plant them." "You believed her?" "I believed she was right about the soil. I saw her tomatoes in January once. January, Calder, ripe tomatoes on the vine, outdoors, no cover, in the middle of a Dawes County winter. Anybody who can grow tomatoes in January isn't crazy. She's paying attention to something the rest of us aren't." Virgil became my helper, my advisor, my friend. He couldn't do heavy work. His back had been bad for years, but he could prune, and he could sort, and he could drive his truck to Garnet and back, which saved me hours that I spent in the orchard instead. He brought me books from the county library, agronomy, pomology, soil chemistry, and I read them at night by the fire with Cinder on my lap and the wind in the chimney, and I learned the language for what Bess had known by instinct and observation. The second ally came in the fall of 1936. Her name was June Oglesby, and she was 24, a graduate of the Agricultural College in Columbia, newly hired as the county extension agent. She had been told about my orchard by the feed store. Word travels. And she drove up the hill on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting to find, she told me later, a crazy old woman's nephew wasting his time on bad land. Instead, she found 60 young fruit trees growing faster than any she had seen in the county, in soil so warm she could feel it through her shoes. "This isn't possible," she said, kneeling in the bottomland, her hands in the dirt. "And yet," I said, "she read 3 of Bess's notebooks that afternoon. She came back the next week with a soil thermometer and a sampling kit and spent 4 hours taking readings. When she stood up, she had dirt on her knees and an expression I recognized. The same expression Bess had when she talked about the bottomland. Not wonder exactly. Recognition. The look of someone who has found something they didn't know they were looking for. "Your aunt's data is extraordinary," June said. 23 years of daily temperature readings. Do you understand how valuable that is? Nobody does this. Nobody has the patience." She did. The thermal anomaly alone, If the soil really maintains 42 degrees through winter, the implications for frost-resistant cultivation. She stopped herself. She looked at me. You already know this. I read the notebooks. You're 15. Yes, ma'am, and the trees don't care how old I am. She helped me after that. She brought instruments Bess had never had, pH meters, microscopes, proper thermometers. She confirmed what Bess had written: the soil temperature, the microbial density, the ash layer at depth. She sent a report to the college in Columbia. The response was polite and skeptical and included a line about further investigation when resources permit, which meant never. It didn't matter. The trees were growing. The soil was warm. The evidence was standing in rows on the hillside, green and undeniable. By the spring of 1937, my orchard had 80 trees. The oldest, the original 20 Winesaps and Arkansas Blacks, were in their second year and had put on growth that June Oglesby said was 2 to 3 times the county average. Several of the peaches, which I had planted the previous spring, were already showing flower buds, which was unheard of for a one-year tree. The bottomland was working exactly as Bess had predicted. The warm soil was extending the growing season on both ends, pushing the trees into earlier springs and later falls, giving them weeks of active growth that trees on normal ground didn't get. I was also growing vegetables, massively, absurdly, almost comically productive vegetables that made the orchard look restrained by comparison. The bottomland produced lettuce from February through November. Tomatoes ripened in May, a full month before anyone else's, and they were the size of a man's fist and the color of garnets, and they tasted like summer compressed into a single bite. I grew peppers, sweet and hot, green and red, in quantities that exceeded anything reasonable. I grew squash, beans, sweet corn that stood 7 feet tall and produced ears so fat they bent the stalks. I grew, in a raised bed along the south edge of the bottomland where the soil was warmest, watermelons that weighed 40 pounds apiece and tasted like summer distilled into fruit. And when Virgil Spate saw the first one, he said, "Bess grew one of those once. Took it to the county fair. They accused her of cheating." He paused. She was delighted. I sold at the feed store in Garnet, where Hollis Turk had come around from bemused tolerance to something closer to respect, though he'd never have called it that. I sold from a stand at the road. I sold to families in town who drove out on Saturdays and filled their baskets and their back seats, and went home with more fresh produce than they knew what to do with. I gave away what I couldn't sell, because the bottomland grew more than I could eat or carry, and waste felt like an insult to the soil that produced it. Mitzdawai Kessler, who had driven me to Garnet 2 years before with a ham and a worried look, now received a weekly delivery of whatever was ripest: tomatoes, peaches, beans, sweet corn, and she would sit on her porch in Macon and eat a Tabor Hill peach and shake her head and say, "That boy," which was all she ever said about it, but it was enough. I was not rich, but I was not poor. I was not hungry. I had a house, a cat, a mule I'd bought from a farmer down the road, a calm, sensible animal named Bishop, nothing like the half-wild creatures of other stories. And I had the orchard, and the orchard was growing, and the feeling of watching it grow was the closest thing to joy I had known in my 15 years of life. And then April happened. The weather that spring had been warm, unusually warm, even for the Ozarks. March came in mild. The orchards across the county bloomed early, and the farmers were pleased, counting forward to an early harvest, calculating prices, making plans. The peaches in the valley were in full flower by the first week of April, delicate, beautiful, fragile. On the night of April the 18th, 1937, the temperature dropped. It didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. A cold front moved down from Canada with the speed and indifference of a freight train, and by midnight the temperature in Dawes County had gone from 54 degrees to 19. By dawn, it was 14. The frost came down like a white curtain, and it killed everything it touched. Every peach blossom in the valley, every apple flower, every pear bud, every plum, every cherry. The cold hit the trees at their most vulnerable, in full bloom, all their energy committed to the flowers open and exposed, and it killed them in a single night. Farmers woke to white orchards, and the white was not blossoms. It was ice. I woke at 4 in the morning to a cold that had no business being in April. Cinder was pressed against my chest, vibrating with displeasure, and my breath was visible in the loft, which meant the fire had died, and the temperature inside the house had dropped below 40. I got up, pulled on my boots and my coat, and a wool hat that Virgil had given me, and went outside. The world was made of glass. Every surface, every blade of grass, every fence post, every branch of every tree on the upper slope was coated in a thin, crystalline shell of ice that caught the starlight and threw it back in sharp fragments. The air itself felt breakable, thin and bitter, the kind of cold that goes into your lungs and sits there like a stone. I looked at the thermometer outside the kitchen window. 17 degrees. In April. I had never seen anything like it. Nobody in the county had. I thought of the valley orchards, all those trees in full bloom, all those open flowers, delicate as tissue paper, exposed to 17 degrees. I knew what was happening to them. I knew they were dying, right now, in the dark. The ice forming inside the cells of every blossom, rupturing the membranes, killing the flowers from within. By sunrise, every petal in the county would be brown. I walked down the slope toward my orchard, and I could feel the change before I saw it. A softening, a warmth like walking toward a stove in a cold room. The frost on the grass thinned as I descended, then stopped. Then the grass was wet, not frozen. Dew, not ice. And the air above the bottomland was moving slightly, rising, carrying the warmth of the earth upward in a slow, invisible current. I held my hand out at chest height and felt it, like standing over a heating grate, like opening an oven door. The bottomland was breathing its stored warmth into the April night, and the warmth was wrapping around my trees like a blanket. I reached the first tree, a wine sap, tree number 1, the first sapling I had ever planted. I put my hand on the bark. It was cool, but not frozen. A world of difference, the difference between alive and dead. I looked at the buds. They were tight, swelling, pink at the tips, intact, not blackened, not ice-burned, not dead, intact. I checked the next tree, and the next. I walked every row in the dark, my hands on the bark of each tree. 60 trees, 80 trees, and every one of them was alive, every single one. The soil thermometer read 44 degrees. The air was 17. The difference, 27 degrees, was the bottomland doing what Bess had always said it would do. The warm earth was radiating heat upward, creating a microclimate around the trees, a bubble of warmth in a county of ice. The thermal engine beneath the soil, the microbial heat, the volcanic ash layer, 40 years of Bess's documentation and everyone's disbelief. was saving my orchard while every other orchard in the county died. I stood in the bottomland at dawn with frost on my coat and warm soil under my boots and my 80 young trees standing alive around me. And I said, out loud, to no one, "You were right, Bess. You were right about everything." Cinder rubbed against my leg. The sun came up. The frost on the upper slope began to melt, running down the hillside in thin silver streams, and the bottomland received it the way it received everything, quietly, patiently, converting it into something useful. The damage to the county was devastating. Every commercial orchard in Dawes County lost its entire crop. The peach growers, and peaches were the primary cash crop of the region, the thing that kept the economy moving from June through September, had nothing. No fruit, no income, no way to pay the loans they'd taken against the expected harvest. The apple growers fared no better. The valley, which had been pink and white and hopeful a week before, was brown and silent. The trees standing with their dead blossoms hanging like wet paper, and the smell of it, the sweet, sickly smell of frozen flowers decomposing in the warming air, hung over the county for days. My orchard bloomed 2 weeks later. The buds that had survived the frost opened in early May, and they opened big, fat, pink and white, abundant, the trees spending the energy that every other tree in the county had lost. The apple blossoms came first, clusters of white with a blush of pink at the center, so thick on the branches that, from a distance, the bottomland looked like it had been covered in snow. Then the peaches, those deep pink cups that smelled of honey and almonds and something wild. Then the pears, delicate and white, trembling in the spring breeze. The bees came. The birds came. The whole bottomland hummed and sang with the sound of a living thing doing what living things do in spring. And it was the only such sound in the county because everywhere else was silence. People saw it from the valley road. You couldn't miss it. A patch of color on the hillside, white and pink and green, surrounded by the brown deadness of every other orchard in sight. Cars slowed, people pointed, some pulled over and got out and stood at the bottom of the hill and looked up at it the way you look at something that isn't supposed to exist, but does. June Oglesby drove up the hill the day after the frost broke and spent 4 hours taking soil and air temperature readings and photographing the trees. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from excitement, the shaking of a scientist who has just seen her hypothesis validated in the most dramatic possible way. Bess predicted this, she said, standing between 2 rows of blossoming apple trees while the rest of the county mourned. Notebook 6, she predicted exactly this. "I know," I said. "The soil temperature differential, 27 degrees. That's even higher than her winter reading suggested. The microbial activity must spike in response to the temperature drop, generating additional heat. It's a feedback loop. The colder it gets above ground, the harder the soil works below." Bess called it the ground fighting back, I said. June looked at me. She was right about all of it. 40 years, and she was right about all of it. By late May, the fruit was setting. By June, the branches were heavy with young apples and peaches, and the bottomland was the only green, growing, productive piece of ground in a county of dead orchards. People came. If you want to find out what happened when every farmer in Dawes County realized that the only surviving orchard belonged to a 15-year-old boy growing trees in the dirt they'd called cursed, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Bess and I spent 40 years trying to tell people, and what that bottomland proved on one frozen night in April, is a story that changed a county and the life of a boy who'd been laughed at in a clerk's office 2 years before. They came the way people come when they need something and are ashamed of needing it. Slowly at first, then in a steady stream. Hollis Turk came first. He drove his truck up the hill on a Saturday morning in June and stood at the edge of the bottomland and looked at my trees, green, loaded with fruit, alive. And then looked back at the valley below, where his cousin's orchard stood bare and dead, and he took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Calder," he said. "Mr. Turk." A long pause. He looked at the orchard, then at the valley, then back at the orchard. The contrast was the whole argument. Green against brown, abundance against absence, alive against dead. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "And I owe your aunt one, but I can't give it to her, so I'll give it to you instead. And I hope wherever she is, she can hear it. You don't owe me anything. I do. I called that soil cursed. I called it sour. I said it grew things wrong. And your aunt..." He stopped, swallowed. Hollis Turk was not a man accustomed to emotion, and the experience was clearly uncomfortable for him. "I called Bess a fool for 40 years, Calder. 40 years. To her face and behind her back and in the feed store where everybody could hear me. And this," he gestured at the orchard, the heavy branches, the impossibility of it, the green living proof. "This was here the whole time. She knew. She tried to tell us. She tried to tell me, specifically, more times than I can count. And I smiled and nodded and went home and told my wife that poor old Bess was losing her mind. She wasn't losing anything. She was finding something. I know that now." He was quiet for a moment. "She came into the store once, must have been 1930, maybe 31, and she brought a jar of that soil, and she put it on my counter, and she said, 'Hollis, feel this. It's warm. In January. Feel it.' And I wouldn't even put my hand in the jar. I said, 'Bess, I've got customers.' And she picked up her jar, and she walked out, and she didn't come back for a month." I could see the memory sitting on him like a stone, the small cruelty of it. Not dramatic, not violent, just the everyday refusal to pay attention to someone who deserved attention. The kind of cruelty that doesn't know it's cruelty until years later, when the jar of soil turns out to have been the most important thing anyone ever put on your counter. "What can I do?" he asked. "You can help me pick," I said. "I've got more fruit than I can handle." He picked apples with me that afternoon. Hollis Turk, the feed store owner, up a ladder in my orchard with a canvas bag over his shoulder, picking fruit from trees that grew in the dirt he'd called cursed. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Mrs. Pace came the following week. She brought a pie. She did not apologize in words, but she came back the week after that with another pie, and the week after that, and by August she was bringing her grandchildren to pick, and I was sending them home with bushels of fruit, and the apology was in the doing, which is where the best apologies live. The farmers came through the summer, peach growers with dead orchards, apple men with no crop, families that were staring down a year of lost income. I sold fruit to those who could pay. I gave it to those who couldn't. When the Methodist Church organized a relief drive for the farm families hit hardest by the frost, I donated 300 pounds of apples and 100 pounds of peaches, and Reverend Alt, who had been in the clerk's office on the day of the will reading and who had, to his credit, not laughed, stood at the pulpit and said that the provision had come from Bess Nye's land, and the church was quiet in a way that I think meant something was being reconsidered. I didn't keep a ledger of who had laughed and who hadn't. I didn't keep score. Bess's notebooks had a line in them. Notebook 2, page 14, in the margin, written in pencil in a hand that was steadier than any other writing on the page, as if she'd thought about it for a long time before setting it down. That said, resentment is poor fertilizer. It poisons the soil it sits in. I believed that. I believe it still. The energy it takes to hold a grudge is energy that could be spent growing something, and I had too much growing to do to waste anything on bitterness. That fall, the county held a harvest festival, a scaled-down version of the one they held every year, sadder than usual because there was less to celebrate. Most of the orchards bare, the mood subdued. I brought 3 wagon loads of apples and peaches and set up at the end of the festival grounds, and I sold some and gave the rest away, and children ran between the tables, eating peaches the size of softballs, juice on their faces, and their parents watched them and then looked at me, and I saw something that I had not expected to see. Not gratitude, hope. The fruit from the bottomland was proof that the frost had not won, that the county was not ruined, that something had survived and was thriving and would go on thriving, and the existence of it, the sheer, undeniable, edible fact of it, gave people something to hold on to when the rest of the season had given them nothing. I could tell you the rest the way a creek tells itself, one thing flowing into the next, the current steady, the direction clear. I expanded the orchard every year, 20 more trees in 1938, 20 more in 1939. By 1942, I had 140 trees in the bottomland, and every one of them grew with the vigor that Bess had predicted and that the warm soil made possible. The fruit was extraordinary, not just abundant, but exceptional in quality. The apples were dense and complex, with a sweetness balanced by a tartness that came from the mineral richness of the volcanic ash layer. You could taste the soil in them if you knew what you were tasting. The peaches had a depth of flavor that people said they could remember for days after eating them, a warmth in the sweetness that mirrored the warmth of the ground they grew in. The reputation spread beyond the county. Buyers came from Springfield, from Joplin, from Kansas City, from as far as St. Louis. A restaurateur from there, a Frenchwoman named Madame Cloutier, drove to Tabor Hill in 1946 specifically to taste my peaches, and when she did, she closed her eyes and said something in French that I didn't understand, and then said in English, "This tastes like the sun stored underground." She bought my entire late-season peach crop for 3 years running. I sold to all of them at fair prices because Bess had written in Notebook 3, in a passage I had memorized, because some sentences become part of your bones. Charge what is fair, not what you can get. Fairness is the only currency that survives every season. I followed that. I follow it still. The county offered to buy the property in 1949. I declined. A development company from St. Louis offered in 1953. I declined. A canning operation offered in 1957 with a sum that made my hands tingle, just holding the letter. I thought about Bess on her knees in the bottomland, digging test pits, taking temperatures, filling notebooks with data no one wanted, doing it for 40 years because she knew the soil was extraordinary and she could not make herself stop proving it. I folded the letter and put it in the stove. "I'm not selling," I told Maeve that evening. "I know," she said. I married you, not the money. I married in 1943. Her name was Maeve Collett, and she was the younger sister of a man I'd sold apples to in Springfield. She came to the farm because her brother told her she had to see it, and she stayed because she understood what she was looking at. Not just an orchard, a proof. A living argument that patience and observation and trust in the ground beneath your feet could produce something the world said was impossible. She had dark hair and a direct way of talking, and she was the first person since Bess who could stand in the bottomland and feel the warmth rising and say, without any embarrassment at all, "The ground is breathing." We married in the house on Tabor Hill, with Virgil Spite as witness and June Oglesby bringing a cake she'd baked herself, which was lopsided and perfect. Cinder sat on the table during the ceremony, and no one objected, because by then everyone knew that the cat did what the cat wanted, and argument was useless. We had 3 children. The first, a girl, I named Bess. June Oglesby published her study of the Tabor Hill soil in 1944 through the State Extension Service. It was read by agronomists across the Midwest and led to a visit from a team at the University of Missouri the following year. Their report confirmed everything Bess had written: the thermal anomaly, the volcanic ash layer, the extraordinary microbial density. They called it the Nye thermal soil in their paper, and the name stuck, and Bess Nye, the dirt woman, the fool, the spinster on the hill, was cited in a scientific journal 26 years after she first started digging test pits in her bottomland. I taught my children the way Bess taught me, by kneeling. I took them to the bottomland when they were small enough that kneeling was their natural height, and I put dirt in their hands, and I said, "What do you notice?" And they said, "It's warm." And I said, "That's right. Now, why do you think nobody else planted here?" And they said, "Because they were scared of it." And I said, "That's right. And what does that teach you?" And my daughter Bess, who was 7 at the time and already smarter than I deserved, said, "That the thing everyone's scared of might be the best thing there is." That was enough. That was the whole lesson. The whole 40 years of Bess's notebooks, the whole story of the bottomland and the frost and the orchard, compressed into a sentence by a 7-year-old girl with dirt on her knees. I wrote it in the margin of Notebook 8, next to her grandmother's last entry, because some things belong together. Virgil Spite died in 1951 at 78 in his house down the road. I was with him. He said, near the end, "Tell Bess I said she was right. She'll want to hear it." I said, "She already knows, Virgil." He smiled and closed his eyes. Cinder died in 1948, which I mention because that cat was the first living thing that chose me. Not assigned to me, not obligated to me, but chose me, walked out of the barn, and decided that I was worth staying for. I buried him under the oldest apple tree in the bottomland, and I did get another cat, a gray female I found in the barn the following spring, as if the barn simply produced them. And I named her Ember, and she was gentler than Cinder and just as present. Hollis Turk died in 1959. His son took over the feed store and planted 20 apple trees in a patch of dark bottomland on his own property that he'd never paid attention to before. They didn't grow as well as mine. The soil was different, the thermal properties weaker, but they grew, and the fact that he planted them at all was a kind of inheritance, a proof that something Bess had known had found its way into the thinking of the next generation. In 1964, the state of Missouri designated the Tabor Hill bottomland as a site of agricultural and geological significance. The plaque listed 2 names: Bess Nye, who discovered the soil, and Calder Nye, who planted the orchard. I stood at the dedication with Maeve beside me and my children around me, and I put my hand on the plaque, and it was warm. Warm from the sun, but I chose to believe it was warm from the ground beneath it. Warm from the engine that Bess had found, and that no one had believed in. Warm from 40 years of patience finally acknowledged. I am an old man now. The orchard still grows. The soil is still warm. The trees still fruit with a vigor that makes visitors shake their heads and ask how. And I tell them, it's not the trees, it's the dirt. It was always the dirt. Bess's notebooks are in the County Historical Society, all 8 of them, behind glass, and school children come to look at them, and a teacher explains about the woman who spent 40 years on her knees studying soil that everyone else called cursed. I tell them what I'll tell you. I believe that every person listening to this has a piece of ground that other people have called cursed. Something about you, a talent, a passion, a way of seeing the world that the room has laughed at. Something dark and strange and warm that doesn't grow the way other things grow and doesn't fit the patterns that other people expect. And I believe that if you kneel down and put your hands in it, you'll find that it's alive, more alive than anything around it, warmer than anyone suspects, ready to grow things that no one thought possible if only someone is brave enough to plant. Bess Nye spent 40 years on her knees in that bottomland, and the world called her a fool. I spent 2 years planting trees in her dirt, and the frost proved her right. The soil had been warm for centuries. What have they told you is cursed? What dark soil are you standing on that you've been afraid to plant in? Kneel down. Feel the warmth. Trust the dirt. It knows more than any of us. If this story reminded you of your own 12 acres of cursed ground, your own notebooks nobody reads, your own bottomland that everyone says is worthless, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're growing in the soil that other people won't touch. Because patience isn't passive. Patience is 40 years of soil temperatures. Patience is a woman on her knees with a trowel. Patience is the ground, holding its warmth, season after season, waiting for someone brave enough to plant. This is where we tell those stories. And yours is next.